Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Chris Nineham. He's joining us from the United Kingdom right now. He's author of a new book, The British State, A Warning, which is available from Zero Books, which is also publishing my book, I should say, for full disclosure. He's also an organizer of the anti-war movement in the United Kingdom. Chris, thank you so much for staying up late and being with us. Appreciate it.
Not at all. It's good to be on the show, Michael.
Chris, earlier in the program, we played a clip of the former Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, saying that the neoliberal model was discredited and that Jeremy Corbyn is a phenomenon. In this relentless onslaught of anti-Corbyn bias in the press across the board, this constant effort of Tony Blair and other right-wing forces in the Labour Party to undermine him, even though Gordon Brown is definitely not as high profile or as popular, but he was kind of the economic brains of New Labour. What is the significance of him specifically acknowledging that?
Yeah, it was an interesting moment. And I think, Gordon Brown, although he was in the Blair government, his instincts were always a bit more what we call old Labour, a tiny bit more kind of redistributional and so forth. And I guess what's really happening here is that, some of the people from, probably a minority actually, but some of the people who were involved in the Blair project are beginning to realise that it was wrong-headed and it was a disaster. And they're definitely, Gordon Brown's definitely right about that. And I guess also there's a wider sense, you can read it in some of the financial papers in Britain, that, even some corporate leaders and so forth are worried about the way neoliberal capitalism is going and how it's losing its legitimacy. And I think the more far-sighted members of the establishment are recognising that there needs to be, at least some kind of a move towards a bit more welfare, a bit of redistribution, and some regulation. I think these are things that are being discussed amongst the sort of liberal side of even the banking community. Not that there's anyone who's actually very keen to really do anything about this.
Yeah, I was going to say, how do you square that with, the New Statesman very publicly and very melodramatically letting them, everybody know that they couldn't endorse this Labour Party? Rory, someone used, I forget now, someone used the example of Martin Wolf, who's the Financial Times columnist, who's longer than most actually been saying we need to get real about the inequality crisis in the financial sector, but he's now having conniptions and catastrophes about labor. What do you make of that contradiction? And then maybe if you could you bridge that with your book, which is really fascinating because to me, I got more of an understanding than I did before, because Corbyn obviously represents a certain quote unquote radicalism given how far to the right the global economic arrangement has become. But in terms of reality, it's a moderate and, just solid social democratic program. But what I got from your book is that even something as modest as what he's talking about is not only going up against modern neoliberalism, but a really bigger continuity of the British state, the British establishment. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that thesis and connect it with how that manifests in the media bias against him, including the people who on one hand can, wring their hands and get so worried about all these problems, but then the next, oh my God, Jeremy Corbyn, we can't possibly have him. We can't possibly do anything about it.
Yeah, well, these are very deep and important questions. And I think one way to understand it is this, that in the period after the Second World War, when you had in Britain and in many countries in the West and elsewhere, actually, when you had a more statist kind of interventionist kind of economic setup, and there was, obviously part of that was spending more money on welfare and the recognition of the kind of demands of, or at least some of the aspirations, baseline aspirations of the working class. That was at a time when capitalism was, in rude health. It was the long boom. It was a time when, profit margins were relatively healthy, growth was good, productivity was increasing in large parts of the Western economies. And so there was a sense in which, the establishment, the ruling class, were happy to bear that. Plus, it was something that was going on around the world, and therefore, was less of a challenge to competitiveness. And even you could argue that there were some reasons why it actually directly benefited the ruling class to have sections of the economy under state control. That whole paradigm obviously started to fall apart in the 1970s. There was the whole turn away from that view. And now you have a situation where, and partly because profitability is still low, productivity in Britain particularly is very, very bad. The margin for, for the ruling class to say, okay, we're prepared to make this sacrifice in inverted commas in order to have a more healthy, happy workforce, it's just not there anymore. And so, the attitude of the ruling class to a kind of reformist project, a kind of, whatever you want to call it, a state capitalist project or a social democratic project, I think is much more kind of oppositional for objective reasons, really to do with the kind of, the health of the system, and also to do with the fact that, it's not happening elsewhere. So, it'd be a particular disaster for. Maybe there will be some shift in general towards more statism. I don't think there probably will actually, but maybe there will. But you don't want to be the first, from the capitalist point of view, you don't want to be the first country doing it because you're going to suffer, So I think there's a kind of, there's quite a deep historical difference. And in that sense, what was, as you say, if you look at the manifesto, the Labour Party manifesto, I mean, it's way more radical than anything we've seen in the last 25, 30 years, but it's probably not much. It's probably similar to what was happening in the 70s and early 80s, what was down on paper. But in these circumstances, it's much more challenging. It actually has a more radical content in reality, because it will involve, for it to be carried through, it's going to be carried through in the teeth of establishment opposition. That's the truth.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.